So we have JR Rahn. He is CEO, correct, of Mindmed?
That's right, yes.
And founder. Mindmed, if you could just briefly, in your own words, tell us what Mindmed is.
So Mindmed was set up to reimagine how we treat mental health in America. It is a drug development company that happens to be developing psychedelic substances because we see a clear opportunity to create new forms of medicine, a completely new asset class of medicines that actually seek to solve the underlying causes of mental illness.
Excellent. And what is the motive? What was your motivation for starting this company? And was there an aha moment? Tell me a little bit about the evolution of Mindmed and how it started.
I don't think there was an aha moment. I think there was years of struggle as a patient in the American mental health care system, really from the age of 8 years old, right? When my mother passed away. And I think my dad and most of my family tried everything that they possibly could and brought me to the best doctors probably that existed at the time. And I was fortunate to come from, a wealthy enough family that could afford all these services. And really went through that for like 22 years of sort of on and off treatment in the American mental health treatment system. And what I realized was, like, I came from a very good background that enabled me to have the best access to care. Not everyone in America had that ability to access that care, and it still wasn't working. It still wasn't actually helping me as a patient. I mean, I found myself on every potential antidepressant and other forms of treatment out there. And so what that all really culminated in, if you want to say that there's an aha moment, it culminated in a friend. I'm in the height of my career in Silicon Valley, working on, at companies like Uber, going through the Y Combinator program, struggling with a massive cocaine addiction, drinking problem, anxiety. And basically a friend saying, look, you should try psychedelic assisted therapy because otherwise you're going to die. Like one of my friends did die from a drug overdose in the months leading up to me actually taking the leap of faith and trying psychedelic assisted therapy. And so that became the basis as, well, wait a minute, these substances aren't all that, like, they're not the devil that, I was led to believe as a child, that LSD and psychedelics in the 1960s and these things that we hear in pop culture. These are actually could be medicines. And quite frankly, we just haven't allocated enough capital to them as a treatment modality. And so, wait, I'm an entrepreneur. This is sort of like second nature to me. Why don't we just set up a company and actually allocate the capital to undertake clinical trials to make these into medicines? And that was because I came from the path of a patient. I am not a psychiatrist. I am not a therapist. I'm a technologist. I'm someone who struggled with mental health and understood that it's really not all that accessible in America. And that needs to change. But in order to change that, we actually need treatments that work. And so that was the incentive and the reason that I set up Mindmed.
We don't need to delve too much into your experiences with that, but you would say that you benefited from those experiences. You noted a shift in your mental health.
Yeah. So I think there's this illusion that has been created maybe by both mainstream media and folklore that psychedelics are this panacea that are going to solve every mental health. And I've even saw like somebody tried to patent it for like psilocybin for weight loss or something ridiculous, right? I mean, like, these are not panaceas, right? Like, they are opportunities, they're catalysts for somebody that is really having some difficulty to have a breakthrough. and I would say more a revelation. And I think the real work that benefited me was in the months afterwards, in the integration period, and actually working through some of the things that came and became top of mind during the psychedelic experience. And so I think we ignore that fact. It's just like we've somehow have made up, or some members of the industry have made up this narrative that we're going to have, the McDonald's of psychedelic clinics on every street corner, and you're just going to pop in and everyone's going to be happy, as soon as they leave. Like, probably not going to happen. There's a deep integration period that is needed to, I think, actually make these successful medicines. And so I don't think we should be misleading the public that they are panaceas. They are revolutionary medicines, right? Like, they are orders of magnitude going to address the underlying causes of many of these illnesses in a completely different manner. But it still requires a process, and it is assisted therapy. It still requires a human. And so there's really never been a drug that's been launched in the United States for psychiatry that's ever really kind of had to have this launch plan. And so I think it's going to be really interesting on how that folds out, and how as an industry we develop and mature and actually build this into a new potential mental health care system.
Again, something's a question regarding your experience, and then we could move on. I'm just curious. Obviously, psychedelics, besides ketamine, which I don't know if you consider a psychedelic, but these are illegal substances. Did you work with a therapist on your own? Were you working with a shaman? How did your experiences go about? And if you don't want to share, I totally understand as well.
Sure. So twofold. I think there are folks that call themselves shamans and aren't actually shamans out there. And
I went to Peru and I did ayahuasca, in full disclosure, and the gentleman that was supposedly a shaman turned out to be a very bad person. So I'm very familiar with that.
Yeah. So I think the public should be aware of that, and it's probably also a reason why we need to credential therapists in psychedelic assisted therapy. Right. I'm not. That's not something necessary for the FDA to deal with. Like, we're a drug development company, and so we're going to focus on drug development. I was fortunate to work with somebody that I'm not going to reveal who or how, but was able to help me. And I think that's ultimately what we're focused on here, right? Is we're focused on healing people and helping people. But I also think we need to do it in a controlled manner. And right now, yes, there is the underground. Yes, there is these shamans purporting to be healers. There are real shamans out there, but a lot of them are not in the United States. And the folks that are, in Hollywood and California pretending to be shamans, I think eventually the buck will stop there. And I think, that's a whole nother discussion. That's not my mission. That's not what we're about. We're about is how do we make scalable medicines that are accessible to everyone to start everyone in America, and eventually on a global basis. In order to do that, you need to provide it to communities that are disenfranchised, and you need to find ways to reimburse for these medicines that people can actually get treatment. Because again, I come from this background that allowed for me to have access to treatment. A lot of people don't have access to that treatment, and it's sad. If you just look at, I rambled this stat off a lot, but it's a really telling statistic. 60% of U.S. counties don't have a psychiatrist. Don't exist in the United States.
You said 60? 60?
60.
Wow.
60%. Now, if you go to rural counties, 80% of U.S. counties, no psychiatrists. Right?
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible.
So psychedelic assisted therapy is important, but what's also important is making those therapies scalable. And so Mindmed, what our thesis is that we need to make a comprehensive mental health platform, right? That allows for these drugs to be launched and accessible in all communities. We don't feel that patenting the color of the paint in the room and the softness of the cushion is the way that is made possible. The way it's made possible, the way that you build a big business, is making these potential medicines, if they are approved, accessible, because you just have a bigger market. Well, why would you want to own the clinic and make a platform that everybody can integrate into and it can actually heal people? That's really what is becoming our mission.
Obviously, with that mission, there's still a huge stigma revolving around psychedelics.
Sure.
How has that road affected you guys to where you are today? Is there any specific stories? I know recently on Instagram, I believe you were banned for talking about Mindmed. Just tell me about that, and tell me some of the other stories as far as the adversity that comes with the stigma surrounding psychedelics.
Yeah, so I don't have an Instagram account at the moment, or a public Instagram account. And I think the reason for that is we started to try to promote some of the stories that were about Mindmed. And so I guess as soon as you start spending money on that platform and you start talking about psychedelics, you get banned. Totally crazy. I've written them a bunch of angry letters. Let's see where it lands. I'm definitely bringing it pretty high up the totem pole over at Facebook. And I think it's kind of crazy that we're talking about mental health here, right? And it's clear Mindmed is becoming a leader in the mental health space with psychedelic assisted therapy. We should be able to talk about that publicly. That's a whole nother discussion, I think for another podcast. But I think it does highlight the fact that society still has not destigmatized mental health, and it certainly hasn't destigmatized psychedelics, right? And so we're fighting two battles there. Like, even for me to talk publicly about my mental health issues, to me, that was like scary at first. Now it's been liberating because I can actually be truthful about, the last 22 years of my life or 23 years of my life, of what really was going down over that course of time. I think it's still a difficult task for, I think, the average person in America to talk about, I'm depressed, I have anxiety, and I've considered suicide. Because I've done every single one of those. I've been depressed, I've had anxiety, and I've considered suicide. And you know what? A lot of people have. 11% of the country is considering suicide at the moment. We've got a problem. 40% of the country has some form of a mental illness or addiction at the moment. It just affects every family in America. And I think we need to start having the conversations about this more. And then psychedelics are going to destigmatize themselves, because if they are a potential solution to these problems, well, hell, like, why aren't we taking them seriously? And by the way, Zach, like, I think we are, right? Like just even a year ago, like when we first listed as a company, people were like, this is totally crazy. It's the first publicly listed psychedelics company. It's not going to work. They're not going to be able to raise any money. I was laughed out of Silicon Valley, venture capitalist offices, a while back, to even like propose this idea. Now they're all begging, like, well, how do we get in? And it's just like, well, guys, we're publicly listed now. It's a little different. You think you might have, here's our stock ticker. I think we, in many ways, by becoming a public company, help destigmatize the space. There's now like 50 or 60 other psychedelic companies out there. A lot of them extremely questionable whether they're actually real companies. But there are good companies out there. There are people doing real good things, and there are people seeking to heal others. And so I'm happy that we've sort of created this allocation of capital towards our space, because I am a capitalist. I ultimately believe that you can be a capitalist, but also be mission driven. I think that you can do a lot of good with capitalism. Capitalism doesn't always produce good results. Like, a lot of things don't. But if we actually want to build a new mental health care system, I think you are going to need large amounts of capital in order to do that. And fortunately, the capital markets and investors from Wall Street and institutional investors and retail investors have sort of caught on to the fact that really big problem here. 40% of the country has an issue with mental health. We should probably be funding novel solutions to actually treat the underlying causes of these illnesses. And that's just like readily apparent, because like the first day that we started trading as a public company, 2,000 shareholders, or a few thousand shareholders. Last time I checked, we had 180,000 individual shareholders. That's pretty crazy, like for a small company that has just started. And so I think that kind of demonstrates the trajectory and the mission that's behind this company, of people that are really, really fed up with not having great solutions for mental health out there, in their support of us.
Absolutely. I want to talk about your specific projects that you're working on, and there's a bunch. For someone who doesn't know the phases, I read that you're in phase 3 trials of this substance and phase 1 trials of that substance. Realistically, when do you venture to guess you'll have an FDA-approved substance?
Well, I can't predict what the FDA is going to do, right? Like, I think realistically, timeline within 3 to 4 years, we have a pretty decent shot of getting some of these things to the market. I think in many ways, psychedelics from a toxicology perspective have been in millions of people. It's very rare that you are conducting a clinical trial where the substance that you're conducting the clinical trial on has been in millions of people. Right? You still need to do the necessary tox work, and you still need to do the preclinical work, and you still need to have sort of the phase 1 data. We have all that. But it's kind of reassuring going into a phase 2 trial or a late stage phase 2 trial, knowing that, as soon as I put this substance into somebody, they're probably not going to die. Right? Like, that's why drug development is so complicated, because you're proving two things to the FDA: one, that it's safe, and one, that's effective. And they sort of look at those sort of equally, right? And so a lot of work is done on the safety first. So that's going to be super interesting. Also, if you want to talk about timelines on like new chemical entities, right? There's like been a lot of talk about new forms of psychedelics that are being created by all these companies. Well, those haven't been in millions of people. They just simply don't have the historicals that LSD and psilocybin and other forms of psychedelics have. That's a little bit tougher. You're looking at anywhere from 8 to 12 years, maybe up to 15 on some of those substances to actually get them into the market and with potential FDA approval. And the odds of getting an NCE into an approval are not great, right? And so we have an NCE approach, like we're looking at various forms of new chemical entities, but we're doing it. We're trying to do it in a more of a de-risk manner. We would like to get an NCE in a phase 1 study by the next 12 months.
Can you explain what's an NCE?
So NCE is a new chemical entity.
Okay.
Right. So what a lot of folks are out there saying is, well, the classic psychedelics like psilocybin and LSD are interesting, but we think we can make a better psychedelic. We think we can make it shorter lasting. And because it's shorter lasting, the economics will be better because they'll spend less time in a clinic. I'm not a total buyer on the shorter the duration of a drug is going to be more effective. I think one of the the benefits of a psychedelic assisted therapy is the duration, and the ability to think things through, right? And so it's not like you're gonna get off work or stop for your lunch break and go for psychedelic assisted therapy. You're going there because you believe that you need the right set and setting, and that you need to be in the right sort of frame of thought and really address some underlying issues. Like, that's why you're going into this therapy session. So the shorter duration argument to me doesn't stack up yet. I do think that classic psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin are going to completely open the market, and they're going to allow us to build the infrastructure for a new mental health care system.
Sure.
To ultimately launch into, right? And that's probably an adjunct to the existing one. But we're going to need to have people that are trained in psychedelic assisted therapy. Like, it can't just be about the underlying drug or the chemical or the molecule. Like, there's so much that goes into this from a launch perspective. So we have to start building that infrastructure like right now. If we actually think that we're going to get, if we think we have a high probability of getting approvals in the next 3 to 4 or 5 years, we've got to start building that infrastructure now, because if it doesn't exist, none of these drugs are going to scale and become blockbuster drugs. And so Mindmed is investing today into how do we launch these medicines in a few years' time? How do we build a comprehensive mental health platform based both on technology and training therapists, psychiatrists, MDs, EMTs, working together to ultimately launch these drugs? And so I think that is, Mindmed started as a drug development company, and I think in a year's time you're going to look back at us and go, wow, Mindmed is as much a technology company as it is a drug development.
I'm going to get to that in a bit, because I have a question that revolves around that. But just to give a brief rundown of your portfolio right now, we have Project Lucy, which is LSD microdosing specifically to target anxiety, correct?
Yeah, so we have 3 commercial programs. The first is Project Lucy, which is targeting anxiety. We've just had a pre-IND meeting with the FDA, and we are going to be making some more announcements about that in the coming months. We're going to be opening an IND for that program and starting those clinical trial. Can you
just explain IND for me real quick?
Sorry,
it's okay.
I say these words all day long and then realize that they're pretty like innocuous 3-letter words that you probably should just say investigational new drug. So you need to set up an IND, or investigational new drug, with the FDA in order to actually conduct a clinical trial on it. It's a pretty relevant step, and we had a very positive discussion with the FDA about opening an IND, and so we'll announce the developments around that very soon. So Project Lucy is seeking to use LSD-assisted therapy for anxiety disorders. The second program that we're working on is microdosing of LSD for adult ADHD. We believe that there's a lot of anecdotal evidence out there that microdosing of LSD allows people to achieve flow states and increase focus. Also, the current solutions out there that are stimulant-based aren't all that great for you. A lot of people want to get off of them. I've been on them. They have all sorts of different side effects. They work. Like they make you focus. They sometimes make you focus a little too much, I would say. And so what we want to do is do the first ever clinical trial evaluating whether microdosing of LSD can increase the focus of a patient. And so we're doing a phase 2 trial of that in the Netherlands with Dr. Kim Koopers, who's one of the leading thought leaders on microdosing globally. And then the third program we have is an ibogaine derivative called 18MC, which is really trying to become the antibiotic of addiction, right? We we believe that there's a dysregulation of what we call the reward pathway in our brains that is caused by constant use of addictive substances. And ibogaine has been shown to have profound impact on addiction. The problem with ibogaine is that there are some safety issues with it that have been demonstrated around causing heart attacks and cardiac issues. And so our belief is that we don't necessarily think that ibogaine will ever become an FDA approved medicine for that very reason. And so what we did was we synthesized out what we believe to be a safer version of ibogaine that's non-hallucinogenic. And the objective is not to put somebody on a pill a day for the rest of their lives. The objective is to, maybe for a year or two, have them on this medicine, but eventually they get off of it. And we have a really big opioid crisis in America right now. So we're gonna target a phase 2 trial with 18MC for opioid withdrawal and opioid addiction.
When you're working with FDA, do you have to target opioid addiction as opposed to alcoholism? Or
yeah,
okay,
totally, yeah.
That makes sense. Another project that I'm not sure what phase you are in, but it's very interesting is the trip neutralizer project.
Yeah.
Can you speak on that?
Yeah. So we call it the LSD neutralizer. Janssen Pharmaceuticals, which also brought esketamine to the market, has an interest in psychedelics. Discovered in the 1980s that a drug called catasrin. It's been on the market for a number of years. It was actually an antihypertensive medication. What Dr. Leakey at the Leakey Lab proposed was, one of the biggest issues with psychedelic assisted therapy is if people come in with some really acute anxiety, right, and they actually are having a really bad trip. And by the way, bad trips can be therapeutic trips, but if they
I've had them.
Yeah. If they come into this for the first time, thinking that they're going to have a bad trip, because every single one of my friends who is curious about psychedelic and psychedelic assisted therapy asked me, well, what happens if I have a bad trip? And so they come into that first session with that acute anxiety. And what we believe is that could have an impact on the efficacy of psychedelic assisted therapy, because you're not really there. The anxiety can lead to it not being, maybe as deep and impactful. So what we're really curious with LSD neutralizer is, can we let patients know that there is an ability to stop this, right? Does that remove some of the acute anxiety going into that session? And if it really is all that bad, a therapist or a medical doctor could stop a psychedelic assisted therapy session, right? And by administering catasrin. So now we're doing a phase 1 study to make sure it actually works. And I think if it does work, it's not like necessarily like a standalone blockbuster drug product. It's probably a feature, right? That, if you're using Mindmed psychedelic assisted therapy, you're going to have this potential to stop. And so I think that could be eventually a selling feature to folks that are scared about doing or engaging in psychedelic assisted therapy. And so I think it's really important to have that possibility and focus on innovation, really, that sort of upgrades these medicines for a Western medical setting, right? They're like, if we're going to convince doctors to use these and to prescribe them and to funnel them into patients into psychedelic assisted therapy, we need to demonstrate that there's also precautions in place so that they're not going to lose their medical license in the future or not want to prescribe these medicines. So it's important. I think there's a lot of promise in the LSD neutralizer.
How do you test that drug? Are you testing it on humans or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how are the subjects picked? Just like normal drugs?
They're healthy volunteers. This study's happening in Basel, Switzerland, at the Liechti lab, and I believe it's a placebo-controlled trial of healthy volunteers. Yeah. The study details are on clinicaltrials.gov. If you just search Liechti lab, you'll see all the studies that we're sponsoring, or a lot of the studies that Mindmed is sponsoring, and ultimately want to translate into commercial drug trials, right? So we really look at the Liechti lab over in Switzerland as sort of our innovation hub. And we have 3 commercial drug trials now. I hope that we have a lot more. I hope that we find some really great things at the Liechti lab and other collaborations that we're working on globally to have as many drug trials out there that focus on mental health, because there's a really big problem out there.
Yeah. You say placebo for that one, for the trip neutralizer. So they're not on LSD and then taking it during that test?
No, they'll be on LSD.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I think the way that we do placebo in that trial is it's catasserin versus placebo, right? So it's like, sugar versus adding catasserin after somebody's on LSD to determine if we can actually stop the trip.
Gotcha. From someone that's gone to Peru and done ayahuasca and have had supremely heavy, for lack of better terms, spiritual, metaphysical trips, what are the conversations Mindmed's having regarding, scientifically quantifying what's happening there? Is there any, or is it sticking more to the microdose side of things?
Yeah, so I think the spirituality and the metaphysical questions around what's going on there is interesting. It's not necessarily something that we're sponsoring a ton of research into. I think what we're interested in is, can we prove that psychedelic assisted therapy is safe and effective? Can we prove that microdosing of LSD increases the focus? Microdosing of LSD increases the focus for ADHD patients. I mean, our mission really is driven upon mental health, right? We want to solve the mental health issues. I think there's a whole, area around spirituality of these substances that, is being researched. There are academics out there looking into that, but it's not the core focus of Mindmed. I don't discount any of that potential. I just know that we have a serious problem in the United States, and I got to solve it along with my team. And so we're going to stay focused on that. But yeah, like there's clearly something going on there with ayahuasca, right? Like,
yeah,
it's pretty hard to deny it. And there's clearly something going on there just with straight DMT. Like the entities and everything that people have hypothesized about these molecules.
I mean, that's what makes them so beautiful to me too. And not to interject, but the thing that really boggles my mind is how these are gonna come into play and start helping people, right? But scientists are not necessarily going to be able to explain what's happening, because the DMT experience, for instance, is so foreign. It's so transcendental. I mean, and there's a stigma with me even talking about my experience and looking like a loony person. But I could say with 99% certainty, I went to realms of existence that made 3-dimensional space and the 5 senses, which dictate this experience, seem like child's play, like absolute child's play. And the thing that I get out of that is I come back and it makes my problems and my anxieties look like child's play too. And that's why I'm curious. I don't know if you have anything to add to that. What I am curious is what are the studies that you're doing with DMT?
So DMT, we're most interested in is like, look, I think if you've done ayahuasca, does that fit into the Western medical system? There's some questions around, how you would actually bring that into Western society. Like, I think there's a place for everything. That one, that could be tough. I think ayahuasca is very powerful, but it's a little tough to bring that into, a convinced doctor to prescribe that. Just given like the bowel movements and
Sure.
the things that are associated with it. But I think, DMT is interesting. And there's a lot of people looking at DMT. What we're interested in is like, how do we actually dose this properly? Could we prolong the effects of DMT? Because DMT is very rapidly metabolized. So we were looking at it intravenously to start, and determining, how do you prolong the effects of DMT? So that's phase one, what we're looking at.
Compass Pathways, they have some patents going on that are questionable, it appears. I read one that it looks like they're trying to patent, everything from using a blindfold and playing music when you're undergoing magic mushroom therapy. Are we walking a scary line with the patents of psychedelics? What are your motivations as far as patents?
Look, I think patent and the contract that a patent has with society and the innovator is that you actually create something of value and then something that is novel, right? Putting on a blind patch or patenting the comfort of a chair and the sound system in a room doesn't really seem like novel innovation to me. So we're never going to try to patent something like that. I think it's, quite frankly, ridiculous. We are going to patent things that are innovative, right? Like things that, we actually spend large amounts of money and we create new forms of inventions. Like, that's why a patent office exists. I'm not anti-patent. I'm all for creating patents, but you better be doing some real innovation in the process, right? And that ultimately should help scale the healing, right? And so I don't think as a psychedelic community we should be against patents, right? Like that underlie, like, it basically, if you're anti-patent, like, don't pick up an iPhone. Right. Don't use Zoom. Don't do a lot of things, because the incentive that patents provide to society to innovate and create scalable solutions to problems is very powerful. But I agree with you. Like, some things are just ridiculous.
Yeah.
And some of these patents that I'm starting to see, it's not just Compass. I mean, Compass has some ridiculous patents out there. I won't disagree with you on that. There are a ton of other companies that have filed some even more ridiculous patents.
Sure. I guess I worry that we're headed towards some, Monsanto-like universe where large corporations are coming after little guys that have a mushroom farm eventually in 30 years. And so, I tend to drift off into potentially, dystopian futures. And I just...
No, I mean, I get the Monsanto, analogy. I keep coming back to the fact that our mission, Mindmed's mission, is to heal people at scale, right?
Yep.
And so we're never going to try to protect something that doesn't help healing people at scale.
Sure.
Like, and making these accessible medicines, right? I think we want to be the platform. I think we want to be the force for good to ultimately allow a whole community that might currently be underground get credentialed and ultimately heal people that are in great need. And I think we're going to need some technology to do that. I think we're going to need some patents to do that. I think the investors that are backing companies like ourselves that are actually going to help build this infrastructure want some protection, right? But there's a very fine line, and I think every company needs to be responsible, and they cannot be grotesque in how they patent things. And so, I think I'm probably going to set up a committee on the inside of Mindmed that basically says, this is the patent bullshit committee, and we're going to go and spot all the bullshit patents that are out there in the psychedelic world. But we're also going to keep ourselves in check that we're not patenting unnecessary things that aren't actually true inventions. And so I think holding yourself accountable to that, if you're really mission driven, and I know that everyone at Mindmed is, we're going to do a good job at handling it.
From what I understand, you're specifically, as far as the next 3 to 4 years and getting to market, these substances will be administered in a therapeutic setting, a clinical setting, right? Or do you see a future where Mindmed is producing microdoses to be taken at home? Do you ever foresee big pharma-like commercials where you're asking people to ask their doctors if LSD is right for them?
Well, I think there's a lot of things wrong with how we market pharmaceuticals in the United States, starting with those really crappy Viagra ads. But, I think what we should really be worried about is, how do we get to market first, right? What's the first bar?
Yep.
And
that's psychedelics in the therapeutic setting, flat out. Totally.
Doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be in a clinic, but it needs to be in a therapeutic setting, right? And so I think there are some things that we can do, and I think there's ways that we can talk to the FDA to define what that therapeutic setting is. And I'm not entirely convinced that it's by creating, ketamine clinics all over the country. Like, to me, people that have set up ketamine clinics aren't probably the best stewards of psychedelic assisted therapy. Just being honest. I've seen a lot of ketamine clinics. Not necessarily a place I'd want to take psychedelic assisted therapy in. So I think the verdict is still out there as to what will ultimately be that REMS that we call that. That's basically what is on the label after these become medicines, and how a doctor can administer them or prescribe them, and how they should treat a patient with it. So still TBD. Ultimately, what I think we need to do is get to a point where these things can be not just microdosing, but macrodosing can be administered in the comfort of one's home, or in a therapist's office, supervised by an MD or a psychiatrist through a telemedicine platform, so that there still is doctor supervision and medical supervision. But the doctor doesn't need to be in the room or even in the building, right? I think that's the end game, because that's how you make these medicines accessible. And that's how you make these medicines accessible for folks that aren't going to pay, don't have the money to pay, $10,000, $20,000 for a treatment in some fancy clinic on Fifth Avenue. That's not my mission. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in actually scaling these medicines for everybody that needs them, because that is the right thing to do, and we should do it. And actually, by doing the right thing, we're going to have a much bigger business than anybody else.
So does Mindmed have any plans of opening clinics, or is that not in the cards at all? Okay.
Nope. I think we want to work with as many clinics as possible. I think we want to work with as many therapists as possible. By owning the clinic, we preclude ourselves from working with anybody but ourselves. Doesn't make any sense. If you want to talk about a monopoly, that's a good way to make a monopoly.
Sure.
If Pfizer was able to open clinics or sort of hospitals, we would all be being treated in Pfizer hospitals, taking Pfizer drugs, and none of the other drug companies could probably administer drugs inside of those hospitals. It doesn't make any sense to me.
I do want to ask, like a broad question. Where do you see Mindmed in, 10 years? Where do you see it in 100 years, ideally? With that being said, what are your biggest fears of what could happen with Mindmed?
So I think there's two scenarios, right? First scenario is society just doesn't get over the stigma of psychedelics. Mindmed gets these drugs approved, but approved in a manner that only allows us to launch it in a very small way, in very controlled clinics. To me, clinics and real estate don't scale, and we basically make drugs for a bunch of rich people that already can probably access these medicines by flying to South America or to Portugal or some other continent, and we don't make any really marginal impact on society or solve the problems that we're out there in the world telling people that we're going to solve. And that would be a major disappointment for me because that's not what I want to do. And I think scenario two is we actually figure out this whole platform approach and actually figure out how we can scale these medicines and they become blockbuster drugs, right? Like the FDA ideally approves them and every American can access them, and we actually solve some of the underlying causes of mental health. That is a great scenario. That is a true renaissance. So I think we're going to go for scenario two. I think there are some companies in the space that probably will go for scenario one because probably the shorter term greed factor will get involved and they'll just sort of settle for one. But we didn't set this company up to have a mediocre result. We set this company up to change how we treat mental health in America, and so we're going to continue doing that and continue innovating. And I think that things that keep me up at night are that we have really successful clinical trials, but society has a backlash towards psychedelics and because of other efforts that are out there that are not through the FDA process. And we don't do, some of those efforts don't launch medicines in a respectful manner or in a manner that Western society is capable of understanding. And so I am somewhat scared of the legalization efforts because I think we should address the acute problems first, and then let's talk about, how can these substances fit into other parts of society. But right now, my mission, 100% focused on how do we solve mental health. And I think there's a conversation to be had eventually around legalization. But I think should be a law that should not be society's, definitely should not be society's priority at the moment when we have 40% of the country with mental health issues and 11% of the country considering suicide. Let's focus on the acute problem. And then we can have a political discussion another time. This is not a political discussion. This is a data and scientific question. Do these molecules work as medicine? Let's focus on that.
Awesome. Well, that does it, man. Once again, I can't thank you enough. Can't thank you for what you're doing enough. I'm someone who has struggled with mental health. In all candidness, I have been self-medicating through psychedelics for a long time, and I don't even call it self-medicating anymore. I feel like they've transformed my evolution and psyche as a human for the better. So
for sure,
yeah. Thanks again.
All right, cool, man. Thanks, Zach, so much for doing this. This is super impactful, and I really look forward to seeing what it turns into.